Hello, everybody. Just getting everybody into the meeting. Give everybody a few minutes to join. Thank you for joining us for our final session today. Give it just a couple minutes. Got people joining. Welcome, everybody. Give everybody just a couple minutes to join. We'll get started. Just a reminder to everybody, if you're not speaking today, to keep yourself on mute so we don't have a lot of background noise as we are recording this session. And if you're not comfortable being on camera, you can go ahead and shut off your webcam. All right, we'll give it one more minute. Still got people joining. We'll go ahead and get started. All right, getting a little bit past the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to session 3 of Intersectionality and Environmental Justice. And we have the lovely Jenna today is going to be sharing her screen so you guys can see the slides. So I'll let her get those up on the screen and then we'll get started. All right. So we'll go ahead and go to slide 2. And this is our popcorn icebreaker questions. So if you want to pop yours into the chat, what do you identify as? But I am also, and how have you been impacted by an injustice in our society? And we have a lot of people on the call today, so we're not gonna be able to do a go round, but please feel free to pop those in the chat if you feel comfortable. Right, and just for everybody just joining, the icebreaker question today is, what do you identify as? But you are also, and how have you been impacted by injustices in our society? All right, we'll keep moving while those are going on in the chat. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Bowman, and I'm with Mothers Out Front. And so just to get us all on the same page in regards to what our objectives are for today and for this entire series, it's one, to truly understand that communities of color do not just live one issue lives, and that environmental justice intersects with different segments of society. Like in the past, in our former series, we talked about youth and pipelines and criminal justice and immigration and disability and elderly. And the second part is that we want to provide practical steps to show up in an intersectional way. We want to make sure everyone leaves here with tools on how they can be the best accomplices or allies or actors, to identify how intersectionality plays a part in all of our everyday lives.
Next slide.
So once again, I'm Stephanie Bowman. I'm with Mothers Out Front. I am the Pueblo and Colorado Springs Climate Justice Organizer, where I focus on frontline communities and organizing, as well as our national movements and campaigns organizer. And I'll pass it to Amy.
And hi, I'm Amy, and I'm the Volunteer and Jedi Director at 350 Colorado, and a mobilization organizer at Stop the Money Pipeline. Next slide. Today, our topics are health, water, food, education, and economic. And in the beginning, we're just doing a refresher on what is intersectionality and what is environmental justice. And then when we wrap up the final session today, we will give you some solutions and practical steps and ways to get involved in the various things that we've talked about over the last 3 weeks. Next slide. And I just want to remind everyone of our meeting norms. Impact over intent is always our guiding principle. Participate, step up, step back, unlearn, relearn, ask questions, wait, mute yourself, don't take up too much space, give space to others who haven't talked on previous sessions, have vulnerability, no email if you're able. For some people, that is something that helps them to focus, but we would really like it if you're able to focus on the session today instead of multitasking. To respect people's racial identities, respect gender pronouns, be aware of your language. Everyone in this session has a right to comfort. And this is a space where we're unpacking and we're relearning things about ourselves. So we want everybody to feel safe and have a space to do those things. Next slide.
All right, so I know that some of you were on our former training, so this slide looks very familiar. So this is just a review for folks who may be hopping on for the first time. Because this entire series is around intersectionality, it's really good for us to all have a common definition and understanding. So the term intersectionality was introduced by civil rights Dr. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw in 1989. She's pictured here in the middle. And the important thing to remember about it is that there are layers of oppression, such as gender, race, and class, that women experience. And so it was actually introduced as a branch of feminism. And so when we come into this series thinking around intersectionality and how it intersects with environmental justice, it's just very important for us to know that really this is around the layers of oppression and how there's several layers of oppression that we all experience in various ways based on our positionality. Next slide. And so when we go into environmental justice, This term was coined by Benjamin Chavis, which is his pictures up here in the top right, in 1982. He was the previous executive director for the United Church of Christ and the Commission for Racial Justice. And he defined the term as racial discrimination in environmental policy making. And it is that enforcement of regulations and laws that deliberately target communities of color for toxic waste facilities. And this is how it's defined from our EPA. And they go into also define fair treatment and meaningful involvement. All right, next slide. So intersectionality. So intersectionality for today is going to kind of look like this. I'm a visual person. So we're going to be talking about the intersection of water, health, food, education, and economics. All right. So this was a question that when we were talking about the criminal justice system in our last training, we talked about actually how does it feel to be polluted on, and like what are the long-term effects. So for those of you that would like to share in the chat, how does pollution make you feel if you lived in it? So Robert shared sick, suffocated, Amy, Nancy, yucky and sick, short of breath, heavy. Julia said makes me feel angry, oppressed, sick, headache, nausea. Correct. You all are on the, that is what it feels like. No one has said happy, right? No one's like, whoa, it's going to feel really good to be polluted on today. No, right? Like, it is not a good feeling to exist in a space that there's toxins being dumped into it. Being slowly poisoned is not a good feeling, right? So I always like to center us around our feelings when we have these discussions, because we all feel differently. And as we go into unpacking intersectionality, it's really important for us to know that how it feels and how it may impact me may be completely different, just based on our lived experience in those systems of oppression and intersectionality. Next slide. So this is a really great, well, not great, this is a very helpful graphic from the World Health Organization that talks about how environmental exposures start in the womb and how this can have effects throughout your lifetime. And most of the time when we think about the environment, we think about outside, but it can also be where we live, it can be in the schools that we learn in, and it can be in the playgrounds that we play in. Perfect. All right. So when we talk about these climate impacts, many of you shared medical and physical ways in which you feel it feels to feel polluted on. But we can actually break it into these three categories. We can break it into medical and physical health. So you may have changes in fitness and activity level, in heat-related illness, allergies, increased exposure to waterborne or vector-borne illness. Then there's the mental health, right? Like, it's that anxiety, that stress. Many of pollutants can cause depression and grief and sense of loss. It also can impact our social relationships. If you're in a sense of urgency and heightened state, you may not always interact and be the most friendliest person, right? Like, it can actually cause you to respond in a way that is toxic. For some folks, it can lead them to substance abuse and post-traumatic stress disorder. And then when it comes to community health, there's been research that shows that there's an increase in interpersonal aggression in how we interact with each other, an increase in violence and crime, which is what we spoke about last week in regards to criminal justice system and how communities of color are impacted. It can also decrease the community cohesion, because if you feel like it's okay to pollute in my community because you view me as less human, I don't know if I view you as a good neighbor, right? Because you are like devaluing my life and my existence. So it can definitely impact community cohesion. So when we think about right now with these protests and with police brutality, and people are like, oh, but I just don't understand why. It's like been 11 days and people are still out here. Like, I just don't understand why they just don't get over it. Well, personally, as someone who has nieces and nephews, 8 in particular, who all have asthma, this isn't just the first time this is an issue where Black people saying they can't breathe. My family hasn't been able to breathe as long as they lived in a community that was heavily being polluted on, let alone you add a knee to the neck. So when we think about community cohesion, it's hard for us to get over it when this has been like a lifelong issue from generation to generation. Next slide. So these are some of the health effects caused by air pollution: headache and anxiety. I'm a frequent person who gets migraines. I don't know about you, but on my days when I have migraines, I'm not a happy person. I may be a little short, I may be abrupt, and being constantly exposed to air pollution can give you similar headaches and anxiety, irritation of your eyes, your nose, your throat, breathing problems. You can have impacts on your respiratory system, cardiovascular diseases, impacts on your liver, your spleen, and your blood, and impacts also on your reproductive system in regards to how it impacts population control. Next slide. So there's a counter narrative I just want to lift up and push against. And for those of you that may agree or disagree, feel free to share in the chat. So many organizations right now are emphasizing that there's a linkage between climate change and population. I always find it to be very helpful for us, instead of focusing on that. Unfortunately, we should not be focusing on how birth rates of people in communities of color impact our waste, but we should actually be focusing on that the consumption, and that there are a few people who are disproportionately gorging all of our energy and resources. But the counter narrative is that, oh, okay, in these low income communities, in these poor communities, if they had less children or we did more family planning, then, you know, it would just be better for the environment. And so it's really important that big environmental groups and family planning organizations stop using images of Black and brown people to call for increased resources for family planning as a part of climate mitigation. And it's very subtle and it's very discreet. And when you see it, it's a really good thing to push back against this narrative, because the counter messaging is important. And by us emphasizing that reduced consumption, energy conservation versus this troubling trend of this focus of controlling reproduction in communities of color, is explicitly racist, and it's victim blaming. We're blaming the same communities that we're choosing that are okay to pollute. Next slide. So when we talk about health impacts, it's really important to lift up that in times of disaster, there's a proven link to spikes in violence against women. And one of the examples expressed in our prior training was around Hurricane Katrina, and how a lot of natural disasters, when young girls or women are displaced from their families or their guardians, that there tends to be more attacks and violence against them in regards to rape, in regards to sexual assault, domestic violence. And it may often be someone they know, right? Like that creepy neighbor that's been kind of looking at your granddaughter for a while. Then a hurricane happens and no one can find anyone, and now your granddaughter's staying with that creepy neighbor. Like this happens consistently, and it's just really important for us to lift up that there is a spike in a correlation between natural disasters and violence against women and girls. So this next part is around health insurance and healthcare access. it's really important for us to acknowledge that there are other reasons that people don't seek care. In our very first training, we lifted up COVID-19 and how it intersects with everything that's going on now. But this is just some information shared from 2016, so it is about 4 years old. But it breaks into two categories: folks who did not see a doctor for needed care, but because of cost, and folks who delayed needed care for reasons other than cost. And Americans are most exposed to toxins and severe weather events, African Americans, but they have the least access to quality health care. Access to health insurance and care ensures that disproportionate disease and morbidity is tempered by access to life-preserving care. For me, what I thought was really interesting is that the highest on the left are Hispanic folk, whereas on the right, who had other reasons other than cost, it's Asian or Pacific Islander. Next slide. So now we're going into allergies, asthma, and as it intersects with climate change. So we know that winters are shorter, and that means our allergy season is longer. I just survived a little bit of the allergy season, and it was very tough. That is a major impact for folks in regards to asthmatic care, needing to purchase inhalers, worrying about updating equipment for your children. Then we have our ozone action days, right? Like we have those days when there's an alert that's letting us know it's not a good air quality day. The third is the rising global temperatures. So that can be that decrease in air quality that happens at that ground level. And then the main ingredient is often city smog. So exposure to high levels of ozone can lead to shortness of breath, like we spoke about earlier, wheezing, coughing, chest pain, temporary decrease in lung function, lower respiratory tract infections in children. And then you add cars and diesel fumes and school buses, and then you have this city smog. And then the last intersection between climate change and allergies and asthma is forest fires, right? When we have an increase in forest fires, that emits those fine particulates that contribute to respiratory illness, decreased lung function, worsening of asthma, and that development of that chronic bronchitis. All four of these examples in how they intersect with climate change was all provided by the EPA. Not the graphic, but the information. Next slide. So often folks ask, why are children more vulnerable? As a mother-led organization, we often focus on fighting for a livable climate for our children and our grandchildren. Children's immune systems are still developing. They're more sensitive to disease and environmental pollutants. As many of you know, they breathe, eat, and drink more for their size. And we could add anything. They spend more time outdoors, especially now in the light of COVID, and many of us have kids at home. We're like, yes, go outside, just socially distance, stay inside the yard. And so they are exposed to more particulates because of that. And they may not be able to understand the things that are happening around them. Next slide. So just an overview, because I know I just went over health really quick, but there's so many facets of how health intersects with environmental justice that this could be its own 1 hour training on its own. But this is just another really great graphic provided by the World Health Organization that breaks down in all the ways in which we all are individually exposed. So that's through our air pollution, through inadequate water and sanitation, through chemicals, radiation, this community noise. Now that this Colorado Springs is growing, and I live off Constitution, and the noise that occurs between Constitution and Powers is crazy. Occupational risks, agricultural practices, and then our built environment. So it's like, actually, how are we expanding our city? How are we building our houses? What are our roads being made of? And is that increasing our temperature? And then climate change. Next slide. And I will pass it to Amy.
All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about food justice, because that plays right into what Stephanie was just talking about all of these impacts. Traditionally, marginalized people are statistically more likely than other populations to live in food deserts. Heart disease kills more Black people every year than white Americans, despite the fact that whites make up about 80% of the total US populace, and Black folks comprise less than 13%. Even children and adolescents living in food deserts are at greater risk for cardiovascular disease. Like, let that sink in for a second. These are babies, kids, teenagers, both now and when they reach adulthood, due to the increased prevalence of obesity in these communities. And as climate change results in more shifts in agricultural yields, this will only get worse for people. Next slide. So malnutrition is an intersection of climate change, and it's a direct result of climate change. Carbon pollution makes our food less nutritious, jeopardizing children's health due to a lack of nutrient-rich and diverse diets. Food grown under the CO2 levels expected by 2050, many common crops will see reductions of protein and key nutrients like iron and zinc from anywhere from 3 to 17%. Zinc deficiencies can dramatically impair immune system function, can cause diarrhea, skin and eye lesions. There's all of these things are a direct result of that deficiency. And when your immune system is not functioning like it's supposed to, because you're not getting the nutrients that you need, you're more affected by air pollution, you're more affected by water pollution. These things all exacerbate health problems in our communities. Iron deficiencies also can lead to weak muscles and immune system problems, cognitive problems, headaches, dizziness, and it can also result in anemia. Pregnant women are especially vulnerable to complications related to iron deficiency. As a mom, I was iron deficient with both of my kids, and it's a hard thing to fix through the food, because the nutrients just aren't there anymore. Protein is a building block of your muscles, skin, enzymes, and hormones, and it plays an essential role in all your body tissue. So protein deficiencies can affect almost all the aspects of your body function. And climate change, in weather patterns also leads to crop failures, which means less food. So these are some of the symptoms of iron deficiency. And it's difficulty focusing, fatigue, crazy, like sore muscles, you're tired, apathy, your nails get brittle. You ever notice you get those little ridges on your nails? That's because you're lacking in nutrients, and especially iron. You can look unusually pale, and it affects your waste systems as well. Next slide. The signs and symptoms of a protein deficiency, it can cause anxiety and depression. You don't recover from injuries as quickly, constant muscle pain, digestive issues, inability to focus, and you're constantly tired, like you don't have the energy to do the things that you normally do. Next slide. So what directly affects this is crop loss and adaptation from changing weather patterns. So this is kind of just a little map to kind of give you an idea of where things will decline due to climate change. California's wheat, tomato, rice, and cotton are all expected to lose to 10 to 30% of their yields. The United States is expected to have more incidents of extreme heat, drought, and heavy rains and dramatic effects on food production beyond 2050. And that's coming up quick. These things are happening quickly now, and will continue to happen if we don't address climate change and the massive social inequities that are facing us. And especially down in Latin America, the Southern Hemisphere is going to be hit hard as well. Their soy crop will slump more than 20%, and that's one of their key exports. Next slide. And then food deserts. This is something, I've lived in a food desert. So 2.3 million people in the United States lived more than a mile from a supermarket and didn't own a car. Growing up, we lived in a neighborhood that didn't have a grocery store close to it at all. And for a long time as a young kid, we didn't have a car. So we had to ride the bus to go get food and walk to do these things or get rides. And it's a struggle. 2.1 million households do not own a vehicle, and more than 2.5 times of them are the exposure to fast food restaurants compared to those living in the wealthiest areas. So if you take a drive, you know, let's use Colorado Springs as an example. If you take a drive through the Springs, you know, up on the north side of town, there's a Sprouts and a Natural Grocers and a Whole Foods and all the little markets, grocery stores everywhere. But if you drive through the southeast part of town, predominantly what do you see? Every 2-3 buildings, you see a fast food restaurant or a gas station or a convenience store. And the food in those stores, it's not healthy. They're not selling fresh fruits and veggies often. That section is like a little basket. So low-income zip codes have 30% more convenience stores, which tend to lack healthy items rather than the middle-class neighborhoods, which is extremely true. And just by popping a grocery store into a community, you can add 150 to 200 jobs by a retail grocery market. And that's putting jobs into the community as well as feeding that community a little bit healthier, a lot better, healthier food. Next slide. Another solution, which I love, is actively encouraging local urban gardening and regenerative agriculture. We have a regenerative agriculture committee at 350 Colorado who have been working really hard on educating people and teaching people how to garden, best practices. And if you're ever interested in getting in on regenerative agriculture, let me know. But community gardens, there's empty blocks of food, not lawns, you know, like we have no use for all this grass. We should be teaching folks how to garden in their own yards and grow their own healthy food, and bringing it into communities and teaching communities how to become self-sufficient and not relying on the government or, you know, being stuck in a food desert. Next slide. Given the direct effect that climate change has on the food supply due to its impact on agricultural yields, as well as the indirect influence of the shifting financial markets, as well as alterations in farming patterns as folks change to monocropping for agrofuel, there are multiple mechanisms that the effects of climate change and methods employed for curbing it on access to affordable and healthy food. Next slide. All right, now we're gonna dive into water, which is directly all these things just in a row. Already low-income communities and communities of color are challenged by polluted water in some cases and water scarcity for reasons in other cases. Droughts are likely to particularly affect the 66% of Americans whose communities depend on surface water, and communities that are disproportionately low income. And I'm going to pop it back over to Stephanie to talk about Flint.
So we all have heard about the Flint water crisis. And I just wanted to lift the question up, and folks can just say yes or no in the chat. Do you believe that our water is safe to drink here in Colorado Springs? I'm just giving a little time for folks to respond. And the reason why I bring that up is because often when in this work and when we talk about intersectionality, we're often fighting against a counter narrative. And part of us getting a consensus of what our own knowledge is, of what we think is going on, allows us as organizers to be better prepared to fight the counter narrative. So I see some don't knows, some knows. I hear some yeses in Colorado Springs, some nos in Colorado Springs, some yeses in Denver, yes in Denver. Someone just answered PFAS and you're early. We'll be talking about that a little bit later. Yes in Longmont. Fountain Creek, no. Not sure. And so the reason why I like to ask this is often sometimes we get lost in all the weeds, and we have to just ask a simple question. If you have someone who's a denier and is like, the world is clean, climate change doesn't exist, I'm like, okay, well, do you think your water's safe? Right? And if you're pausing and you're contemplating it, then obviously your first argument wasn't necessarily valid, right? And so I just always like to base it there where you can just ask folks, do you think it's safe? And if there's a hesitation, then obviously we're thinking about all these systems that have control over our water and we're unsure. And with that, I will pass it back to Amy.
Next slide. All right. So in the last couple years, extreme rainfall and storm surges from hurricanes like Florence and Harvey flooded industrial facilities that were ill-equipped to handle such massive storms. The contaminants ranging from oil and gas to toxic metals were let loose by floodwaters and spread into surrounding communities. And these discharges may be accurately described as toxic floodwaters. Storm-induced or climate change-related flooding that carries toxic and hazard contaminants. Toxic floodwaters have serious health consequences. After Florence and Harvey, residents in North Carolina and Texas complained of headaches, burning eyes and throat, dizziness, and many other health problems. Public health professionals raised concerns about the floodwaters leaving a hazardous residue in homes, businesses, water systems. And such health and environmental risks are amplified by social and legal factors. For example, like communities that lack access to transportation, reliable transportation, and temporary housing are more likely to face prolonged exposure to floodwaters and residual contamination. In this way, social vulnerability interacts with the geography and climate to produce a health crisis. Next slide. And then fossil fuel infrastructure and water quality threats. Fracked gas pipelines threaten water quality for low-income rural communities and communities of color. Groundwater contamination, leaks and spills. All these things are from erosion and sedimentation, increases flooding in urban areas, and damages to wildlife and fisheries are used as well. But the water, if you think about how much water is used in fracking and how much water is used for coal plants, and once we don't have those coal plants anymore, that water goes back into public use. That water goes back to the people where it should be. And thinking about how much they use to frack a well in Colorado, it's absurd to think that we're wasting our most precious resource. Water is life. Water is our first medicine. And the fossil fuel industry doesn't care that they are poisoning the water for communities, especially you guys saw what happened at Standing Rock almost 4 years ago, trying to put a pipeline in under the river and through indigenous territory. And how many times have we seen stories since then about how many times has that leaked, that pipeline? We didn't say if it would leak, we said when it would leak. So the fossil fuel industry is directly responsible for sickening communities through their water, through their soil, through their food, the air they breathe. It permeates every bit of our life. Next slide. And now I would like to welcome our guest speaker for this afternoon. Liz Rosenbaum is from Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition, and I adore Liz. She has been doing some of the most amazing work in Southern Colorado to fight for clean water. And I will let Liz take it away for the next handful of slides.
All right, thanks, Amy. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. I know I should have done a sound check ahead of time, but that didn't happen. So welcome everybody for tuning in. And I'd like you all to take a second after this is done to log into your local water coalition, Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition. It is on Facebook. I'll type in a link to find me, or you just do the search FVCWC and it'll pop up right away. I started this coalition in 2016 when I realized that there were other people in the community like me who didn't feel like their voices were heard. So if you want to switch to the next slide. All right. So some of you have heard about the contamination down here in Fountain Valley, and realize for some of you it's only a mile or two away, and you need to be concerned with what is downstream from you. Case in point, the water from Amy asked, or Stephanie asked a really good question about, do you feel like your water is safe? For years, we were like, yeah, it's safe. I mean, we have an aquifer, and we're right by Colorado Springs. So those of you in Colorado Springs, just so you know, the water you get is first source water. That means you have first dibs. That water you have first dibs on should never be contaminated. Why? Because it gets filtered through water facilities over 800 times before it gets to the Gulf of Mexico. We don't want to be the first source water and screw it up for everybody else, right? So I want you all to close your eyes for a minute and think of your earliest childhood memory of water. Did you jump in puddles? Was it swimming in a friend's backyard, running through a sprinkler? We all have that connection with water. And when we were little, we're just like, wow, water is fun, right? I want you to all have that in mind of your childhood memories of water when you think about it as an adult. Because we are the adults that have to be concerned with the complexity of, is it safe? So young children can, no matter what, go play in a sprinkler wherever they live, right? Now, the water that was contaminated, the water contamination that happened in my community came about, you know, it's been going on for decades. And it's called PFAS, poly and perfluoroalkyl substances. Now, I have a college degree in high school history and anthropology, and never knew that I would someday have some sort of slight connection to chemistry, but I do. So the first thing that started off in our community was a complete outrage. Our El Paso County emergency response team was ready to bring in truckloads of water to us, thinking that this had just happened and it was going to be an emergency situation, and they were going to come in with water from Colorado Springs. Then we find out that it had been going on since the 1970s. And just to give you timestamp, I was born in 1976, okay? I moved here in 2003. A lot of the people in this community have been here for a really long time. Fountain, Widefield Security started off somewhere around the 1950s. Fountain was here before Denver was here. It was almost considered to be a location for the state capitol. So that's how busy Fountain was in the past, right? So we're sandwiched between two military bases. You have Fort Carson on the west, then you have Peterson Air Force Base on the east, and we're sandwiched in the middle. In the 1990s, the Department of Defense said, they put out this big statement, stop using PFAS, which was used in the firefighting foams to put out jet fuel fires. It's really effective with that, right? However, when the military asked DuPont to create this chemical, they were never held accountable for saying what this chemical was. So DuPont had decided, well, we're going to see what else we could do with this chemical. That would be fantastic. And then they came up with no stick Teflon pans. So we've got it in toxic firefighting foam that only puts out jet fuel fires. This foam is used anywhere that a semi is transporting fuel. There's some storage facilities out by Schriever Air Force Base that have a collection of it, but it's not used, okay? So is it a horrible awful chemical? Yes, right? So DuPont decided to then say, this is fine. Why were they allowed to say it's fine? Because when the EPA was created, there's a thing called the grandfather clause. They were grandfathered in to being allowed to do whatever they had been done before. Now, how does the grandfather clause? That's racist, right? Some of you may already know this. So it does, back to slavery time periods, people who were enslaved, who were now free, were told, if your grandfather voted, then you could vote. Of course, everybody who was white, their grandfather voted, so they were grandfathered in. So please, from this further out from this moment, say exempted. No one should be exempted from anything, right? Chemical companies should not be exempted from following the law. Okay, if you want to do the next slide. So the military told everyone to stop using these chemicals. Fort Carson stopped doing it in 1990. Why on earth did Fort Carson continue to do it until litigation in 2016? It's because of the location. Now, this is me having Liz Rosenbaum's personal perspective and separate from the Fountain Valley Clean Water Coalition or whatever else that I do. But from what I came to understand is that because Peterson Air Force Base shared Colorado Springs Airport, they decided they were exempted from that mandate because Peterson Air Force Base is not a DoD facility. Also, don't forget, Colorado Springs owns the property that Peterson Air Force Base sits on. Fort Carson owns Fort Carson. So they weren't exempt. They had to go ahead and stop using these chemicals. So these chemicals were just sprayed down, practiced all the time, put out all these jet fuel fires, practice, practice, practice. And we're all thinking, if there's a chemical that puts out jet fuels, then we should probably not just spray it down into the ground, right? Because we're smart enough to not dump oil from our cars. You know, we see everything along the streets, drains to creek, don't dump waste here. Makes sense, right? But DuPont told everybody it is like soap because it's a surfactant. What the heck is a surfactant? It is something that changes the surface of water, like soap. So toxic firefighting foam changes the surface of water, so it's a surfactant. So therefore, it's like soap. I'm sorry, it's not like soap. Otherwise, everybody would be using Dawn dish soap to put out jet fuel fires. Small towns would spray the foam for kids to play in for 4th of July parties and, you know, town get-togethers or whatever, you know, by lying, yeah, right, by lying to everybody who's consuming it because they were exempt from the law and it's odorless, you know, all this stuff, right? So we've got currently here over 70,000 residents and we've been contaminated since the 1970s. This nasty stuff got into Fountain Creek, right? Fountain Creek, and there's another slide in here that kind of shows. Fountain Creek goes in and out of the aquifer. There we go. Fountain Creek goes in and out of the aquifer. You can see that underneath. It's called the Wide Field Aquifer. So the water goes into the aquifer and back out to Fountain Creek, and it just keeps going in and out, right? So as you look at this photo from security, those were the most contaminated areas. Then Wide Field, and then it stops for a little bit with a contamination in Fountain Creek, and then it picks up again just south of that word fountain. So we don't know how the water moves. There has to be studies on that, but that's what happened. So in 2016, our water districts found other water sources right away. So if you've been drinking this water since 2016, you have not been drinking contaminated water. Now, this aquifer water was only used during certain months of the year. The rest of the time we had surface water, you know, that's coming down from the mountains and some other places. It wasn't being pulled up from the aquifer. So if you lived in security, you had the most contaminated levels to you because it was closest of how it moves through. Then wide field and less in fountain for exposures, right? So we started up this water coalition. We figured out, hey, what the heck is PFAS? How does it apply to me? A few years into it, we really start understanding that there are several components of PFAS. So, you know, shout out, raise your hand if you've seen the movie Dark Waters. Yeah, okay, so that contamination, that community is from Teflon, PFOA, PFOA. That's Teflon. PFOS, PFOS, is Scotchgard, the stuff that makes everything waterproof. PFHXS is toxic firefighting foam, which may or may not have PFOA or PFOS, depending on the chemical makeup of the recipe of the manufacturer who makes the toxic firefighting foam. So this is where the military starts playing semantics with us, but we're too smart for them. When in 2018, U.S. Air Force Academy said, oh, we're contaminated too. And all of us down here are like, we told you to test way back in 2016. Why are you doing it now? Well, they're saying it's not that big of a deal because Colorado Springs Utilities is now the source of water. They tested everything. They came back and say PFOA, PFOS is at a non-detect. I'm like, big deal. What's the toxic firefighting foam level, the PFHXS? They came back. We had to do a Freedom of Information Act with the peer organization. It came back above 70 parts per trillion. Right? So what can you do as a consumer? We only have 2 people interested in that community to be an activist. They don't have enough people worried about it being contaminated. They don't understand this is a forever chemical. So you have your cell floating around in your body. It's looking for a protein, right? Then here comes a PFAS chemical. It looks like a protein. It's going to attach to your cell. It's going to go to your kidney. Your kidney then decides if it's a good cell or not. And if it's one with a protein, whoop, kicks it back into your body to use again. It can't tell the difference between a chemical, PFAS, and the protein that you need to finish off that cell. So that's why it's called a forever chemical in your body, because every time it gets to your kidney, it's like, oh, that's a good cell, boop, back into your body. So it very rarely comes out, right? So we've got Widefield Security Fountain, Strathmore Hills, and then we've added to this list. I did this list back in 2018. There's also Wigwam Water District down where I just moved. It's at 50 parts per trillion, and it's not getting filtered like it is in these other areas. We're up to Peterson Air Force Base, groundwater tested at over 88,000 parts per trillion. So if you live close to Peterson and you had a well water there, it's like drinking a tire. Remember in the movie Dark Waters? You know, why would you drink that? That'd be like drinking a tire. You don't want to drink this chemical. Next slide. All right, so what does it come down to communities and taxpayers? The financial challenges with PFAS exposure is that it's a forever chemical. It builds up in your body. From that movie, you see there's 6 major health effects from this chemical, autoimmune disease being one of them. However, there's like 200 different autoimmune diseases, and it takes almost 5 years to figure out which one you have. My husband just figured out what one he has in February, and it's a scary one. So this whole COVID-19 is pretty eye-awakening. You know, you think you're healthy, you're in your 40s, and then you're like, but I really don't feel good. And it takes you 4 years to figure out what's wrong, right? So when we worked with Sierra Club, by the way, Sierra Club is amazing. We would not be at the point where we are in the state of banning these chemicals without the assistance of the Sierra Club, which then brought in 350 and peer organization, environmental justice, like you name it, Sierra Club is literally saving our lives here. They had the financial means to pay an organization to be our lobbyists, to work on this every day besides all the time that we personally went up there. And when we're up there trying to get House Bill 1279 passed last year to ban the chemical, we kept hearing pushback from a certain political party. We're pro-business. We don't want businesses to incur any costs. I'm sorry. This needs to be in their business plan. Filtering these chemicals needs to be in a line item in their budget, not mine. Because to get an MRI to find out what my husband had wrong with him was $1,300. I do not see any of these manufacturing companies saying, let me take care of that bill for you. No, they don't. Plus our medical bills, and if we're lucky that we have access to healthcare right now, because a few years ago we didn't. We have several long-time family units here that have been here for generations, and one family has lost several family members to kidney cancer. Some have had kidney transplants. It's devastating. And there isn't enough money in the world to bring back a loved one who has passed away from kidney cancer, which is one of the health effects. It leads to a large portion of us to still buying bottled water because there's that mistrust of what's going on. So even though our water districts say we're filtering everything to a non-detect, the people who can't financially, they're taking on the extra financial burden of buying bottled water. Where I live, I know it's 50 parts per trillion. I get water delivered to my house. If I boil that water in a pan, it coats the pan with this white film. It's very strange. So I am not drinking that. Chronic illnesses costs are devastating to family finances. They're worried about decreased property values, but so far we haven't seen that in our area. If you want to go to the next slide, or is that my last one? Okay, so we're still in danger. Everybody around the United States and around the world is still in danger of PFAS chemicals. The EPA is not going to move slightly on banning these chemicals because there's PFAS chemicals, there's 4,700 of them. PFOA, PFOS, and PFHXS are the three main ones in our community. Now, should you throw out your Teflon pan? I mean, that's your call, really, because the exposure that's most deadly is when you're ingesting it in large amounts of water into your body. But a few flakes from a Teflon pan, you know, I'm not going to tell you to throw it out. I've replaced most of mine by now. These chemicals, the half-life is 5 to 8 years. So then after 8 years, then it's another half-life. So when we did a 200-person blood test study, we had to get a grant. And the average American, say Amy Gray has never lived here, your levels from exposure somewhere in the world is 1.4 nanograms per liter. I'm not that much of a chemist, but it's a tiny little amount, right? Every American has this nasty crap in their body. My level is 19. 19. My husband is 30. There's people in our water coalition with 50 nanograms per liter of this, and they've had cancer, if not a couple of times. So if someone ever tells you, oh, this doesn't cause cancer, oh crap, it does. And the community that's most affected are our firefighters. Because get this, their firefighting gear is called turnout gear. It is loaded with PFAS chemicals, water repellent, fire retardant. Just, it's loaded. And the way they get the cancer they get the most is testicular cancer, because that's the most vulnerable area of their body. So they're wearing all their gear and they're spraying this chemical for practice. And then they're going home in the community and drinking the water. So this bill, first and foremost, was to protect our firefighters. They were the most vulnerable. And our area, the Fountain Valley, is the only one where the Department of Defense has admitted to dumping these chemicals 3 times a year. So if you want to do the next slide. Voter disenfranchisement and underrepresentation. I know you're going to dive into this a little bit more, but for us, military community here, they're not voting on local issues here, but it's a state that is starting to ban these chemicals. Underrepresentation, think of all the children who live here. You are being contaminated without your knowledge. You know, with air pollution, some of the things that you can tell that the air is, you know, sooty outside. But PFAS chemicals, it is so tiny that you don't even know what's happening. So I appreciate you all tuning in. I'm gonna, in the chat here, give you the Facebook page. I really encourage you to like it. We have third Thursdays at 6:30 are coalition meetings if you want to find out more. And some of the actions are really easy. Call your elected official. But what I want you to do right now, you've got a ballot in the mail. Please vote. Please drop off your primary ballot. If you live in my area, I'm running for the House district seat because we need to have more legislation to protect our drinking water from more than just PFAS. So thanks for tuning in. You guys are amazing.
Thank you, Liz, so much. All right, and I think her connection, her screen froze, so I'm not sure if she'll try and jump back in, but thank you, Liz, and I'm gonna pass it back to Stephanie to talk about voter disenfranchisement and underrepresentation.
Yeah, I see Liz still frozen. Okay, so thank you for that, Liz. The segue for us going into voter disenfranchisement, underrepresentation. So remember, this session is about intersectionality with environmental justice and climate justice. So just to give a little background, the 2020 election, this will be our second presidential election without the full protection of the Voter Rights Act. Just keep that in mind. 2016 was our first. In 2013, the Supreme Court gutted a key provision of the Voter Rights Act. So for those who don't know what they gutted the approval by the Department of Justice. So within hours of the Supreme Court making this decision, states that had a long history of discrimination passed sweeping laws that limited entire communities from access. Can you not hear me?
You cut out for 1 second. You're fine now.
Okay, you can hear me now. Okay, that was weird. I don't know. Okay, I don't know where you last heard me.
It was only like 2 words.
Okay, so there has been good news, right? Like, although, you know, our last presidential election, we didn't have full protection. Since then, courts have been struck down in 6 different states due to restrictive and racist voting laws. That would be North Carolina, Michigan, Texas, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Kansas. All of these laws have been put in place by Republican-controlled legislators, and they targeted either African-American voters or Latino voters or college students or low-income Americans or even indigenous voters with some of the address requirements. Next slide. So I wanted to kind of open it up and just ask for folks to share in the chat, what does voter disenfranchisement look like in the Springs or in Colorado or near you, in your opinion? And for those who are like, whoa, I don't know, what do you mean by voter disenfranchisement? I put 2 definitions here. The first being the action of taking away the right to vote from a person or group. And the second is a feeling in a person or group of having no power or opportunities or of not being represented in the political system. This 2-part definition was provided by Cambridge. And so just feel free to share in the chat. So I see, thank you, Robin, for sharing. She's put Spanish speaking Reading voters cannot read ballot correct. Keeping an open dialogue with county elections for polling stations and drop boxes. Someone shared that their hometown doesn't have a voting center anymore. The closest one is 1.5 miles away. Julia shared that they have made it extremely difficult to vote in the Ohio primaries after COVID canceled the in-person voting. You have to have printer, money to mail, etc. Kermit shared inadequate voting equipment, supplies, and poll workers. Fewer polling places in Black and Brown communities. Fonz shared Colorado is one of the better opportunity states with mail-in ballots, however, language needs should be met. Dave expressed mail-in ballots don't work well for homeless populations. It's very true. People with family obligations, such as single parents, may not be able to commit the time to wait in socially distanced lines or processes. It was shared in Weld County. This looks like Bella Romero, where Latino residents of mixed immigrant status have no voting rights or the ability to participate due to language barrier. Nancy shared that the drop-off box locations are placed in odd locations. Liz lifted a question, are translations available in Colorado? I'm not for sure on that answer. And Jenna shared going to vote, but finding out you are no longer registered. Yes. Betsy shared Colorado has incredible unrestricted rules for homeless voters. They can list the nearest business or homeless shelter. Yes, there's states with higher population of homeless, like in LA, I had to register homeless. They would put cross streets that they tend to live on. Even though those cross streets may change, they could use those cross streets to register to vote. Alrighty, we can go to the next slide, but feel free if you think of more things to share that, because this is a growing training and we're going to continue to build on this as we go. So from where I stand, as someone who's been like a battleground state grasshopper, traveling from battleground state, working for candidates over the past 15 years, I would say that Colorado has done an excellent job covering all the nuances of caucuses and primaries and election dates and eligibility. But for me, there has always been like this one glaring omission around eligibility when voting with convictions in Colorado. And so just to make sure everyone's on a common understanding, and you may already know this, but this information provided by the Secretary of State, this is just some basic information. So if you are incarcerated for a felony conviction, does this affect your voter status? It is illegal to register or cast a vote while serving a sentence. But once you are currently on parole, you may vote. Persons sentenced to parole are considered to have completed their full term of imprisonment, as that term appears in the state constitution. If you are awaiting trial or serving a sentence for a misdemeanor conviction, can you vote? This was something when I was engaging voters 2 years ago, this was a common thing that most folks didn't even know, that if they're just awaiting trial, are they still able to vote? And the answer is yes. Next slide. So here are some additional questions that we're just going to go over briefly. So do you have the right to vote if you're on bond and your criminal case is pending? Yes, you are eligible. Do you have the right to vote if you are on probation? Yes, individuals on probation may register to vote and cast their vote in any election. You'll be surprised at how many folks don't know that, or even just ashamed to have the conversation just due to the social implications to being someone who's been convicted of a crime. I have a criminal conviction in my past. Do I have the right to vote if I have served my sentence? Yes. In Colorado, you have the right to vote even after you have served your sentence, the day you are released from detention or incarceration. Now, when we talked about before that question is what does voter disenfranchisement look like? I'm going to read this next answer for you, and you let me know if you see anything in there that just seems a little alarming. So will I get an official letter telling me when I'm eligible to vote? No. You would not receive an official letter telling you when you are eligible to vote. At your initial meeting with the Division of Adult Parole, the division must provide certain voter information to you. So now it is the responsibility of you being at that first meeting, and the division must provide the following. They must provide your voting rights, how you may register to vote, how to obtain and cast a ballot, and how to obtain voter information materials. Now, I'm someone who's super into voting, so that doesn't sound overwhelming for me, but I just imagine having this first adult parole meeting and someone giving me 4 different packets of all this information without you actually registering me, right? You send me away with 4 different packets. So when I think of voter disenfranchisement, there's these systematic ways in which we make it harder for someone to be able to complete the action, right? And it can be unconscious or conscious, right? Like, who knows? Maybe the intent is just to give them all the information necessary, but the system could very well make it a little less daunting. Next slide. So when we talk about underrepresentation, feel free to share in the chat, what factors do you believe prevent people from running for office? Jenna shared money. Betsy, money. Money. Self-esteem. Access to resources. Skeletons. No time. Flipping to the dark side, Amy. No mentors. Social media and other vectors of abuse which make people decide it's not worth the hassle or risk to their family. Class, ethnicity, previous records and crimes, the depleted quality of our democracy, anger issues, already working 40 hours a week at other jobs, not imagining that you can win, imposter syndrome, that's very real. And so the reason why I ask this question is often when we talk about underrepresentation, I often hear this narrative of people saying, well, there's not enough good people to run. And I sit in community spaces where I hear community members stand up and they advocate for what they know that they want. And I often ask myself, what is preventing that person from running, right? Like, what systematic processes or what oppressive factors are preventing that particular person from running? Yeah, definitely having tried before and failed. No one likes to lose, and to lose publicly is hard. And so like all of these factors prevent people from running. But when we talk about intersectionality, I think it was only one person talked about class and race and ethnicity and being like a prior criminal, right? That is really where intersectionality intersects with underrepresentation, is because although we want our boards and we want our city council and we want our representatives to match the diversity of our communities, there are systematic factors that intentionally keep out those type of people from running. All right, next slide. So underrepresentation can be whether it's zoning boards that hold the reins for permitting toxic facilities that too often land in low-income communities and communities of color, or it can be our public utility service commissioners who are bestowed with the responsibility of regulating electricity rates, or it can be our city council, which approves everything from development projects to municipal orders on clean air. there are multiple offices that are instrumental in upholding communities' rights to have clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, clean land to live and play and grow our fruits and vegetables on. But if communities aren't represented in these offices, and these offices don't see themselves as beholden to the interest of these communities, we have the circumstances that exist nationwide, and particularly in the South, with cancer clusters and asthma pockets and areas of concentrated birth defects that are generally called due to underrepresentation. Next slide. So in addition to voting for president and Congress and mayors and governors, these smaller, these less recognized offices are so critical to the survival and well-being of our communities. And that's something that I know Liz lifted up, is if communities that are being heavily impacted are also underrepresented, then how can we fight and advocate for changes in these issues? Next slide. So now we're going to get to my least favorite topic to talk about, candidate suppression. Some people like to call it selection. And this is just a summary of kind of what everyone shared earlier, like what are some of the reasons that only a certain type of people choose to run for office. So we know funders, right? Funders in regards to the type of staff you can hire. If you are a small donor ran campaign compared to these larger donors. Resources, having access to resources and tips and tricks and tactics on how to win. And also just having this, I'm trying to think of the right word, but having this strategy that's passed down from winning candidate to the next potential winning candidate that they do behind closed doors where they pass the baton. And they give all these winning tactics and strategies because they want someone similar to their values to take their seat, to ensure that all the work that they've done hasn't been undone, right? And then when it comes to the state and the county party, right, there's these alliances that show up where the county party may favor one candidate over another, or the state party may favor a candidate over another, and that stakeholders who are in places of power within these spaces are able to leverage resources and information to ensure that these candidates make it through. This is something we definitely saw in this last election when it comes to all of the women candidates that we had running for various seats, and how when it came down to it at the very end, when it came to delegates and things like that, there were certain people who were not a part of the process or were selectively omitted. Pay. What we choose to pay our candidates determines the type of candidates that run. And it also determines the type of constituents. I have heard in several sessions someone like, oh, you should run for office. And they're like, oh, well, I would have to move first because where I live, I don't know if these would be my constituents, right? And so there is that aspect to it where due to how communities are cut and how our precincts and areas exist, that some candidates may feel like the constituents wouldn't support or represent them due to bias, implicit or explicit. And then the last is positionality. Often people don't want to run in a race where there's already a whole bunch of people running. So they tend to say, oh, I'm not going to do it this year. You could be a very viable candidate, but you're like, no, I'm going to sit back. I'm going to wait because there's 6 people. The probability isn't in my favor. And so these type of political dynamics can really impact the type of candidates that we have the option to choose from. And until we address all these different factors, we may consistently have underrepresentation. And this is like the messiness, unfortunately, when it comes to local politics. Next slide. So I just wanted to bring this up as a conversation. It's one of the first things I noticed when I moved here. Colorado Springs City Council makes $6,250 a year. What type of candidates are we leaving out by offering that type of pay? And someone can feel free to unmute themselves if this is your topic. Or if you don't want to, you can share in the chat. Yes, young people, working moms. Low pay leads to upper class volunteers. Teachers. Correct. You don't see many people of color. Basically anyone who's not already super rich or well off in society. Low income community members. Working class folks who can't afford that. Anybody in the bottom 75% of income. Anyone without existing wealth. Exactly. So Barbara said older folks and business owners are the ones who can run. So when we think about like this unconscious or unspoken suppression of candidates, our city council is a perfect example. The fact that that's how much they make in a year prevents certain folks who are activists and who are leaders in this community from feeling like they can run and they can win. One, because they have to work full time, fundraise, run their campaign, and your goal is to make $6,250 in a year. That really only allows a certain niche set of folks who have a certain life privilege to be able to represent us. So like this is a prime example of how underrepresentation shows up just in systematic processes, because the fact that this is not a livable wage for our current cost of living in this city is deplorable. And the fact that it does not represent the diversity of the city is also deplorable, considering how our projected growth of population is expected to reach that of Denver, right? And $6,250 a year. So with that, I will pass on the slide deck to Amy, and we will talk about the next topic, which is economics.
Yes. So environmental and climate injustices result when we have an economic system predicted on a profit-driven focus, achieved through exploitation and extraction with a pervasive disregard for human and civil rights. We therefore have development that doesn't take environmental or human impacts into account. White entities amass wealth and use profits to suppress democracy, from voting rights to policies that protect the environment and communities to corruption of our local judicial system, while polluters dump and burn toxins in our communities of color and low-income communities with impunity. Besides the direct impacts of toxic exposures to the communities that are host to polluting facilities, there's also the effect on the climate, which through disaster, sea level rise, and shifts in agricultural yields also disproportionately affects communities of color and low-income communities. The impacts of environmental and climate injustice are far-reaching, including compromising our health, economic well-being, educational outcomes, as well as displacement, cultural erosion, criminalization, and political disenfranchisement. Economic vulnerabilities and disaster, like Hurricane Katrina and Rita, as well as the tornadoes and the flooding that happened in 2011, and to some extent, BP oil drilling disasters, demonstrated how substandard housing stock reliance on public transportation, under insurance, for home, business, health, are all economically based vulnerabilities that make African American and brown communities more vulnerable and less resilient in the face of increasing disasters and severe weather resulting from climate change. Next slide. There's also the impact of the changing agricultural market on farmers, especially black and brown farmers. The impact of climate change on weather patterns has increased droughts, which significantly jeopardizes already vulnerable Black farmers. Next slide. Many experts are projecting that Denver and the Front Range will be the next Las Vegas, Phoenix, LA, in terms of population growth. The population that resides between the Springs and Fort Collins, if not like all the way to Laramie, is projected to increase by 6 million or more. With increased growth will come more air pollution, as well as traffic congestion, waste management, land use conflicts, stormwater issues like pollution into urban lakes, streams, and rivers. Most importantly, we must begin to ask ourselves what all this growth will mean for our lower income neighborhoods. Portions of the population in places like North Denver, Lamar, and Pueblo are already struggling with pollution from industry that surrounds them now. Increased urbanization will make things worse unless our policymakers start making better decisions to address the environmental injustices that the poor regularly face. Next slide. Oh, there's one more. You could go back. I don't know what happened. There's one missing. We are already seeing the economic impacts of climate change. According to Morgan Stanley, climate disasters have cost North America $415 billion in the last 3 years. Much of that due to wildfires and hurricanes. And by 2050, they estimate that cumulative damages from climate change will reach about $8 trillion, impoverishing the entire world as a whole by 3% of GDP, and the poorest regions by more. There was a study published in 2018 that warned if we do not seriously curb greenhouse gas emissions and start to adapt, climate change will severely disrupt the US economy. We already saw with COVID-19 how incredibly fragile this capitalist system already was. And that was a trial run. Wait until the climate change kicks in high gear. Warmer temperatures, sea level rise, and extreme weather will damage property and critical infrastructure, impact human health and productivity, and negatively affect sectors such as agriculture, forestry, fisheries, and tourism. The demand for energy will increase as power generation becomes less reliable, and water supplies will be severely stressed. Damage to other countries around the globe will also affect US business through disruption in trade and supply chains. In 2017, Texas's estimated losses from Hurricane Harvey were about $125 billion. Hurricane Sandy caused about $71 billion of damage in 2012. It's insane to think about that. Like, just let that sink in, like how much money that is, and the communities that are affected by that. And agriculture is another sector that's really vulnerable to climate risks. Extreme rainfall events have increased by 37% in the Midwest since the 50s. And the regions have experienced above normal amounts of rain and snowmelt that have caused historic flooding. Many fields have just been washed away, livestock drowned. Nebraska lost $440 million worth of cattle, and Iowa had suffered $106.1 billion in losses. That's a lot. And the NOAA expects that in the coming years and months, through all of this, this keeps happening, it's going to impact our food supply. To date, farmers have, they plant about 67% of their corn crop compared to last June, when they had planted 96%. And that's because of rising temperatures, and that the growing season is becoming shorter in areas. So infrastructure is another really big one. Our society's critical infrastructure is severely at risk of flooding, as evidenced by, you can see in Miami, their entire town, they're building it higher. They're having to reroute all their pipes. They're having to deal with their stormwater, and every time that there's a storm down there, the city is flooded. Military bases are vulnerable. The DoD has acknowledged that climate change is a serious risk to the military. And if they are seeing it and they're preparing for it, our government should be as well, although we know that they're not. Other things that will be affected are tourism, businesses and financial markets. So there's an opportunity to build a better world, but we have to address the inequities of capitalism on climate change and vice versa before we can get there. Next slide. All right, back to Stephanie for education.
Yeah, so I was thinking just being cognizant of time, we are at 2:30 right now, and I would really rather be able to dive into practical steps with folks, Amy. I just wanted to get your perspective. Not that education is not important. We can still share these and send these slides out for you, but I really want to make sure that we have time for us to talk through practical steps. What do you think, Amy?
Yeah, let's do that. Jenna, can you skip ahead to slide 61? Or was it one before that?
Yeah, the one before that one.
Sorry, my bad. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
So these are just some practical steps for us to organize in an intersectional way. As we started in our very first training, we talked about positionality and how everyone has your own unique position. And that position is where you have observed and lived through. That position is how you can advocate and be an ally, be an actor or be an accomplice. So you first have to recognize the difference. Recognize the difference in your existence and your lived experience and other people. Avoid oversimplified language. We really try to dive into definitions, what things mean to you, how all of this may look differently for all of us, because we know that oversimplified language can invalidate or negate lived experience. So often it's nothing wrong with, if you're leading meetings or you're facilitating conversations, to just open it up. Let people share what they think a word means. Analyze the space that you occupy. Many of us occupy space that's comfortable, which means we tend to be in places where we are around our peers and folks who have the same lived experience as us. If that is the case, and 90% of the space that you occupy is around folks who have the same positionality as you, it's important to acknowledge that may need to shift. You may need to make yourself uncomfortable and put yourself in places where you are interacting with folks who have a different positionality. And that's why we gave that homework out of the first session, where we asked you to talk to folks that you love and you care about, and talk to them about their unique positionality. Because often our grandparents or even our grandkids or our nieces and our nephews and our cousins have all different positionalities and ways that they exist. And we need to be okay with talking to them about it. Seek other points of view. Show up. And don't make assumptions. In one of the trainings Amy and I did in the past around ally versus accomplice, we talked about the difference between assumptions and presumptions, and how often we assume things and we don't have evidence to back it up. And that's based on bias, and that's based on generational bias that's been taught to us, and we apply those to people without them even opting in. We have to change the narrative. I know I've lifted up a few of narratives here that I oppose and want to push against, that many of you had different perspectives, and that's okay, right? Like, in order for us to fight systematic oppression, which is what we want to do in regards to climate change, because this is oppression, it's intentional pollution of certain communities, that we have to be okay with talking about oppression and not thinking that this is like a personal attack on someone being American or patriotic or anything like that. It has nothing to do with it. It literally is that in order for us to improve our environment and make it livable, we have to fight against colonialism, and we have to fight against capitalism, and all of those things intersect. And I know for some of us, like my husband is prior military, me mentioning fighting capitalism or militarism, he's like, oh my goodness, why would you ever do that? But I want a livable climate for my children, right? lift up intersectionalities. There's nothing wrong with it. And even if you aren't even sure if it intersects, pose the question. Like, do you think these two things impact each other? And just let people talk it out. Because if you live in your own fishbowl and that's all you've ever known, you may not see the intersection. But someone who sits under those different layers of oppression may have a completely different perspective on how those intersectionalities impact their life. Advocate for teaching environmental justice in the classrooms. That's one of the things that we were going to talk about in the education system, is how environmental justice and having these conversations need to occur, not just in high school, not just in middle school, but all the way down K through elementary. Just talking about how all of these things intersect, letting kids know that if your first hour of the day is your hardest class consistently, and you ride the school bus and you always feel disoriented, and maybe the particulate matter from the diesel school bus that you ride on that makes your first class of the day so hazy. Avoid the trendy fad of going green. Often when we use the language of going green, there's a layer of privilege assessed to that. I remember sitting in a training and someone was saying, oh, everyone needs to get rid of their gas stoves and move over to induction, and this is what we need to do. And in theory, I understand their point, but I had to lift up that changing your stove is a privilege. Owning a home and having power to change your stove is a privilege. If you're a renter, that's a whole nother can of worms, right? So it's like, we have to acknowledge that although we may be in this place of comfort and we want other people to shift and make these changes as us, not everyone can go to solar panels. Not everyone can change to induction ovens. And so that's where us having this conversation around intersectionality in class and how class relates to the climate movement. Generally, when we talk about going green, people imagine seeing white women or white men hugging trees and putting out solar panels, and people impacted by this. And so it's just really important that although going green is what we want folks to do, that we know that that language in itself is very privileged. Next slide. And so we wanted to make sure that we left you with all the different ways that you can get involved based on the topics and types of intersectionality issues we talked about. We didn't identify groups for every single issue because Amy and I had an honest conversation about feeling comfortable and shifting people to organizations we felt had integrity in their work. So there may be issues that we talked about that there isn't an organization lifted up. That is due to our own personal organizing experience and feeling like they would do you all justice. So we didn't omit them because we didn't think there wasn't anyone doing the work. We just may not have had personal experience where we would feel comfortable sending you all to them to advocate for those issues. Alrighty, and next slide. This is the intersectionality of what we talked about today. Next slide. This is a graphic I would say that you consume for your own personal reflection and homework. This talks about the intersectionality between the impacts based on climate, what issue or how it impacts our actual climate issues, and then the actual health impacts that it puts on our communities. This is a really great starting point when you're talking to folks who are climate deniers. I often start at the furthest end. Like, oh, you know anyone with asthma? Huh, where do they live? What city? Do any of their kids have asthma? Do they have good health insurance? Is their bill high? And after you kind of get them to that point, you're like, oh, so they live less than 3 miles to a coal fire plant and have all their life. When they were pregnant, did they live there? And I often find starting at those outer issues and working your way in is a really great way to like knock down that barrier when you're talking to climate deniers. And I believe that is questions. We're at questions part. So I know we're 10 minutes over. If anyone wants to ask any questions, feel free to put it in the chat, or you could Yes, the PowerPoint will be shared. We will share that out. And if there aren't any questions, I'm just going to go to the next slide. I'm launching with Mothers Out Front a series of upcoming trainings. It's called our Eco Training Series. We dive into anti-oppression and anti-racism work because we know it's all intersectional. So our next one is June 17th. We're doing around ally versus accomplice. We designate the entire time for you to unpack where you are. If you're an actor, if you're an ally, if you're an accomplice. So this is something you're interested in. I can send the link out and also make sure that Amy is able to send it out to you all when she sends out the PowerPoint if you want to register. And next slide. I just want to send peace and love to all of you all. These are trying times. This is hard. This is scary. We're dealing with a pandemic, civil unrest under a tyrant in an election year. And I just want to just send you all peace and love. And we can only fight oppression together. We cannot do this alone.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us for 3 sessions deep diving into intersectionality and climate justice. We appreciate all of you and your time, and we hope to see you all soon at one of our other webinars or in the near future. Hopefully, we will see you at an in-person action very soon. Thank you guys so much. Have a wonderful afternoon.